Well, lovely to meet those of you who did come. Thank you very much. I love doing these lectures, and it's great to have you here again. Now, as you know, I'm no longer going to be doing my tours. I had a wonderful one in September, and that was my great finale. But I can't give up the idea of attaching a narrative to place. And so this time I've decided to move to Rome rather than to Paris. And the reason for this is that Rome hasn't been completely changed the way Paris has. Remember, Paris in the 19th century was totally renovated, destroyed, and rebuilt under Napoleon III. It's not the same with ancient Rome. You can actually still walk in the footsteps of the Vestal Virgins, where they went from the Temple of Vesta up to the Capitoline Hill for the sacrifice, and in the case of Cornelia, to her tomb, literally. So this was I've decided to go in October to do a series of YouTube videos walking in the steps of these interesting women. And the women that I'm doing today, first of all, today, of course, it's going to be Cornelia, the Vestal, and Agnes, the saint. But the other ones that I will be doing will next week be Beatrice Cenci and then the painter Artemisia Gentileschi. And as I was looking at them, I realized that what they had in common was that they were all victims in some form or another and were only famous because of their victimhood. Really up until the 20th century, or really the 20th century, women didn't become famous for anything else except these exemplary, gory deaths in one way or another. And the other thing that I found that they had in common was that it all revolved around whether they were virgins or not. And this became sort of a major, in fact, at the time of their notoriety, this was a major factor. So, and it still plays out. For example, their Artemisia Gentileschi has become lately very famous, and there is an exhibition of her in America, and right, they've got her paintings, but they've also got a special rape room, which is really bringing up a huge amount of controversy. You know, there was so much more to this painter than just the fact that someone lifted her skirts at a certain stage. But anyhow, we all know there's stories of rape and all the rest of it at the moment. So today, I want to take you to ancient Rome uh, at the time of the Flavian emperors. Now, I've put the Colosseum here for you because to sort of anchor it in time for you. Now, the Flavians there were just three in this dynasty, and the one who interests us is Domitian. Now, Domitian was an extremely powerful emperor. He was trying to pull the empire back to the values of Augustus, who had been the first emperor, who'd set up a whole lot of moral values, and really was the person under whom the empire gave its impetus to expand and the basis of which would become the Roman Empire that we know. Well, things had not gone right in between the death of Augustus in about, I think it's about 60 BC, Common Era, and by the time that we had civil war and Roman values were falling. So Domitian is going to be somebody who is wanting to display a return to austere Roman values. And so I want to now turn to what was happening, well, the thing that interests us in 91 Common Era. And this was the condemnation of the senior Vestal Virgin Cornelia, Cornelia Maxima, who was supposed to have lost her virginity, and we'll see what this means throughout the lecture. She was condemned in a court at which she was not interviewed. There was no physical examination. It was just decided that things were going wrong. It must be the fact that a Vestal Virgin had lost her virginity, had broken the vows that she had made to the Roman state, and so she must be sacrificed. And so the sacrifice is really what we're looking at. So we're going to see an extraordinary procession. Now, this is Pliny the Younger, who writes in his letters about this dreadful ceremony. Then the one, and what I want to emphasize here is the gender status of a Vestal Virgin. By the time we've stopped speaking about it, you will realise that she has surrendered her state as actually being a female, has assumed some masculine attributes, and actually Pliny doesn't quite know how to address her. He can't use the word id, meaning it. So it's a sort of gender issue. It's really quite interesting. All right, so the one to be punished is placed in a sedan chair. They cover it, all right, from the outside and fasten the coverings with ropes so that not even a sound is heard. And they escort the sedan chair through the public spaces. In other words, that's through the Roman Forum. Everybody moves aside in silence and they attend it without any noise and with dire gloom. There is no other spectacle more awful, nor does the city experience a more abhorred day than this. When the sedan chair reaches the site, the servants untie the bindings. Then, before the punishment, the high priest makes some secret prayers, stretches his hands towards the gods, brings forth the altogether veiled one, and places her on the ladder which leads down to the chamber. So, what awaits the Vestal Virgin? This is her going down into the chamber, which is just outside the Collean gates. I don't know why this isn't working. I think I might be, yeah, not it. That's better. So this is what happens. Now, there was a law against spilling the blood of a Vestal Virgin, and there was also a law about burying the dead inside the walls of the city. So to get around both of these very powerful legal aspects, the Vestal Virgin was buried alive. So she could be buried within the walls of the city because, after all, she was a priestess. So she is taken down into this chamber and she is given enough water and a little bit of bread and enough oil for a lamp to burn and for her to stay alive for 2 days. So this was really a horrible death, as you could imagine. Fortunately, I think she would be suffocated because, of course, they would then put dirt over the top, not onto her, but on a scaffolding. But she would be sitting there, and she was then supposed to have brought about her own death. It's not the state who has killed her. So this was an exemplary type of death because the Romans had their own death penalties. If you were a slave or a criminal or even a foreigner, you would be crucified, as we know. If you were a Roman citizen, you would be beheaded. But this was a special type of burial just for a Vestal Virgin. So who indeed, whatever's, God, it's completely jumped. Excuse me, I'll have to, oh, that's right. Because it's being recorded, we can't go back. Terrific. Oh, all right, okay. Let's keep going. I mean, fortunately, I can speak underwater through a straw. Right. Well, who were the Vestal Virgins, and what was their status, and what were their privileges, and why would someone be punished this way? Well, the College of Vestal Virgins was set up like about 800 BC by the second king of Rome, and it was set up for the worship of Vesta, in a temple. Now, Vesta was the goddess of the hearth, who was a flame which had to be kept alive for no matter what. All right. So if the flame went out, it sort of meant that Rome itself was in peril. The entire sort of welfare, prestige, and all things Roman relied on the fact that this fire was kept going. And the College of Vestal Virgins was set up to do nothing but, well, almost nothing but their main function was to keep this flame alive. And this was the temple in which they would be, and which is still partially there. It has, of course, been rebuilt. Now, here we have a woman is working on the sacred fire. I just want to... Now, there were very, very few images of Vesta. All right. Now, Vesta was the goddess of chastity, of purity, and she was only in the temple. There was no statue of her, just the fire. Now, this actually has been unearthed in Herculaneum, and of course, by the time you get south, you know, provincials, they get it all wrong. They've actually got a statue or a picture of the goddess Vesta. This is most unusual. Now, she actually has often, she is so shown here with a donkey. That's because they also milled wheat to make sacred cakes to be used in ceremonies. And she also has three of the things that she has in her temple. This is a phallus, a wooden phallus. I mean, you must wonder whatever that is for, but you never know. This was supposed to be the god Fascinus, which refers to, I'm really having trouble here, refers to male potency, which of course is very much related to the idea of virtue in ancient Rome, vir meaning a man, virtu meaning having manly characteristics. So you have the wooden phallus, but you also have a statue of Pallas Athene, which was supposed to have been taken from Troy. And of course, the Romans say that they are descended from Aeneas, who fled from Troy. And of course, you have the sacred fire. Now, these are the things that only women could access. Only women could come into this particular temple. All right, so this is the only group of priestesses or priests who are women. Now, who were the Vestal Virgins? Well, this is an example of one of them being chosen. There were 6 Vestal Virgins at any time. They were chosen between the age of 10 and 12, and 12 was the age at which Roman girls would be married. So in other words, this sort of marked the idea of the beginning of their fertility. They then serve for 10 years as apprentices, and I don't know how long it takes to learn to keep a fire going, but you know, 10 years. Then there's another 10 years where they keep the fire going, and then there's another 10 years where they teach people how to keep the fire going. So they weren't overworked, as you can see. Now, who were these people? Well, they were very, very careful. They had to be just prepubescent, all right? They had to come from an aristocratic family. They had to have both their parents alive, and I'll look at that in a moment. They had to have no mental or physical impairments, all right? You didn't want a cross-eyed Vestal Virgin. So these girls then were taken. They didn't actually take a vow. They were simply taken by the state. Oh, God, it's done it again. And put into the power of the Pontifex Maximus. So in other words, they are removed from their family, and they no longer have a family. They become daughters of the state. This means that they have a totally different legal status from any other woman in Rome, including even the empress. Now, at the time, it did vary over the 800 years or something that the Roman Empire exists. Roman women had very little, had no legal status. They were citizens, but they couldn't vote. They were utterly in the power of their father. This was called the potestas, or the paterfamilias, who had right of life and death over all members of his family. And in fact, when his daughter, or even later when the father dies and she falls into the power of her husband, if the child is born, it's put at the feet of the father and he decides whether it will live or die. Now, this, of course, doesn't happen too much later on in the Principate because women were not having many, the aristocratic women weren't having many children at all because death in childbirth was horrendously high. So, in other words, these Vestal Virgins have now become synonymous with the state, and they are allowed to leave the Vestal Virgins at the age of 40 or 42 after they've done 30 years service. And so 42 would be also at the age when they could no longer have any children. So in other words, there's fertile years when they could have been doing what all Roman women were supposed to do, which was to be a daughter, a wife, and a mother. The Vestal Virgin don't fit into that category. All right, they don't also fit into the category of the family. A woman who was born into a Cornelian family, for example, doesn't have her own name. She takes the name of her father, which is, if you look at Roman family trees, you get a lot of Claudias, Augustas, Julias, and so on. If you were the second girl, the first girl's Julia, the second Sagona, and the third one's Tertia, which, can't have been much fun. Obviously, they would have been given some other name, I suppose. But the point that I'm trying to make is that these women, in many ways, become non-women, since the whole function of women was to reproduce. And therefore, they go into an area of a different type of gender, which is desexualized, almost a kind of female eunuchs, and they consecrate their virginity, in other words, their fruitfulness, to the city of Rome and to their chastity to the goddess Vesta. Now, since the Vestal Virgin is the daughter of Rome, if she breaks her vow, she then and has sexual relations with a citizen of Rome. This isn't not just adultery, but it's incest, all right? Because she's the daughter of Rome and the Romans are all her relatives, all right? And so this was an extraordinarily, seen as extraordinary betrayal and worthy of death, and not just because she'd broken or betrayed this, but because her doing this could threaten the fabric of the Roman state. Right? The Romans believed that they had a transactional religion where you actually give something to the gods give you something back. You didn't turn to the gods for your spiritual, why am I here? What is it all about? And all that. If you did that, you went to a philosopher or you just got on with your life. You weren't worried about the afterlife. The Romans actually believed that you lived on in the hearts of the people you left behind, which seems eminently sensible to me. Anyway, here we have then the Pontifex Maximus, who, as the chief priest, in a way sort of works as her father. So here we have some Vestal Virgins. What I also want to emphasize is that the view that we have of these Vestal Virgins is very much that of the 19th century, where there's this kind of, frisson, a bit of sort of all of these, fresh young ladies tarted up to the nines, a little bit like nuns, fiddling around and flapping around with roses. In actual fact, they were pretty tough nuts, I can tell you. So what did they do? What did a Vestal Virgin do? Well, there aren't very many replicas of them because painting at the time wasn't done on canvas. There were frescoes, I suppose, some in Herculaneum. This is from here. There they are tending the fire of Vesta, they're veiled and so on, making the cakes, which would be used in ceremonies, also washing the place out with special water from a special fountain, but also they had rights, as we'll see in a moment, that other women didn't. For example, they also kept wills, and they also got a cut of the will when people died, which meant that some of them became immensely wealthy, but because they didn't belong to a family, they could will it, but they couldn't will it to their own members of the family. They would have to will it to different temples and so on. So these were the functions that they had, and they also were very much evident at banquets. There they are there. Um, just to sort of show you how important they were, this is even at Caracalla, which is in the 3rd century Common Era. On one side you'd have the head of the emperor, and on the other side you have the Vestal Virgins helping the emperor make significant sacrifices. So sacrifices to the gods for the well-being of Rome, you always had to have a Vestal Virgin there. All right, so even though there was only 6 of them, in fact really only 4 operating, they were an immensely powerful and prestigious group. Oh, I don't believe it. You. They also, now what were their privileges? Well, they lived in really luxurious surroundings. Now this is what is left, or has part of been a little bit reconstructed in the Roman Forum. We have, it's a 3-story building, as you can see. Here, I mean, no one else apart from the most wealthy of the Senate and the emperor had such luxurious apartments. Here you have, they all had their own room, they had their own servants, they had central, as the Romans had, they had central heating, they had running water, they had baths, all of the things, of course, which die when you move into the Middle Ages and Christianity takes over, because the Romans really, as I said, were focused on the here and now, which is why you get the wonderful roads, architecture, the armies are so successful, and so on. Of course, they had their own baths. They wouldn't have actually had to go to the baths with anybody else. This is what, of course, remains if you go to the Forum today. Here we are up. They would have lived up here. This was their own little sort of courtyard, and you can see in many ways how the convents, as we'll see when we're talking about Saint Agnes, the Christian groups of women who are virgins, in other words, who work as nuns, you can see very much how the courtyards and the cloisters and so on are based on the way in which the Vestals lived. Here we have some of the statues of them, which don't look terrific now. I just wanted to show you also that they lived at the absolute centre of Rome. Right now, the Forum was the centre, but if, for example, you had a Roman general who was going to process in triumph, these extraordinary triumphs where all the prisoners would come and everything that he'd managed to capture, and if you couldn't capture anything, you actually had placards or people acting out the battle. So they were absolutely the beginning of cinema, these extraordinary triumphs. They would come through the Arch of Titus up here and process down, and this was the Via Sacra, the sacred way, and they would go past the temple of the House of the Vestals and come up to the Capitoline Hill, where they would sacrifice to Jupiter, who was the god of king of the pantheon. Now, what privileges did the Vestals have for keeping that keeping that fire alight, making a few cakes, and so on? Well, they were the only women who had an armed guard when they went out, and they went everywhere. Right, it wasn't a cloistered order at all. Considering that their virginity was so sacred, you sort of wonder, why did they let them out? Well, it was no one would touch a Vestal Virgin. If a Vestal Virgin was touched, you'd be put to death, and a gory death too. You'd be crucified, basically, unless you're a Roman citizen, that's beheaded. So that's a doodle. All right. So we would have an armed guard, also a kind of covered sedan chair, which would be carried around, and the only other people or person or female who had that sort of chair was the empress. All right, so you can see again this extraordinary prestige that they had. They would, as I said, officiate with the royal family or with the imperial family. Here we have Augustus, and next to him is a Vestal Virgin who will be leading the sacrifice. And this is actually in the Areopagus that Augustus has set up. They were invited to banquets. It was very prestigious to have on the list of your invitees. Oh, do come tonight. I've got Cornelia coming. My goodness, they were very educated. They weren't just firelighters. They, were sort of witty. They were sort of well known for their education as well. The other thing, which this is these soppy 19th century sort of ideas of what they were like. They're always looking frightfully demure, totally wrong in the dressing and all the rest of it. But here I think is much more like it, where we have them looking like a couple of, Collingwood supporters. Yeah. Really. This is this idea of they got the front row seats at the gladiatorial fights. At all of the public occasions, you had the Vestals there. This is actually incorrect. This idea of thumbs down, it's incorrect. It was thumbs that way, which meant, kill him. All right, that's incorrect. But anyway, it doesn't matter. That's what's gone down in the 19th century, right? This is the great century of, visualization of the ancient world. Oh, right. Okay. The what I'm wanting to do is to look at um, the way in which the Vestals sat in a very ambiguous position. Now, the slide that you just missed or you fleetingly saw was the way in which they were dressed as a bride. Now, they had the most complex hairdo, which was called a Saint Agnes. In other words, the hairdo was plaited in 6 plaits, which was very complex. It had to be done back and forth and over and above. Took hours to do, and it was also bound with red and white wool, the white for the purity of Vesta and the red for the flame of Vesta. Now, they were usually veiled when they went out, veiled in the sense that they had a piece of coming over them here, not that their faces were veiled at all. But this was what a bride was dressed as when she was about to go out and be given to the husband. So in other words, they were dressed as though they were brides, but they also, this is a coin showing the dressing. I have to be so careful with, I don't know what's going on. Skipped another few. This then is very difficult to tell. This is again at Herculaneum. Now, Herculaneum actually was buried during the reign of the brother of Domitian. So this would be in about 80 something, no, in the 1990s, 80 AD, round about then. But it's very difficult to tell whether this is a Vestal Virgin who is being prepared for a ceremony or a bride. It is probably a Vestal Virgin because of the purple that she has. The purple was the most expensive colour that you could possibly get, made from snails and so on. But the way in which her hair is being done makes it look as though she's a bride. Now, right. Now, the way in which they were dressed, however, was that of the classic Roman matrona, the married Roman woman. All right, so in other words, you have the tunic, which comes straight down here. You have the stola, the pallium, which is actually pinned up in the corner here. So in other words, she fits into no category, either from the point of view of her gender or from the way in which she appears. So not only has she abandoned the state of not femininity, but of being a female by not being reproductive, but she also has gained all of the aspects of male privilege, which was having a lictor, being able to speak in the Senate. In fact, she even had such power that when Sulla was trying to have Julius Caesar put on the death list, the Vestals all got up and spoke on his behalf. So a lot of power, even political power, which was usually reserved for elite men. All right. So therefore, they were really outside the matrix of Roman society. So that means that, of course, if she steps aside and betrays this, she has to be put down, so as to speak. And the problem with this was, of course, that the Vestals could be used as scapegoats. If things were going very badly for Rome, it must be that the goddess had abandoned the city, even if the fire hadn't gone out. In fact, if the fire just went out, you'd just be beaten in the dark so no one could see. But when, for example, the Romans were fighting the Carthaginians and they were suffering massive defeats at Cannae and so on, 2 Vestal Virgins were put to death, because it would have to be that the gods had turned against them. It would have to mean that a Vestal had betrayed her vows or the city of Rome. So there was a darker side to being a Vestal, before you all rush out and try and see if you can so be one. Now, what I wanted to look at is in the 19th century, this when you actually get a real sort of division then of females. Because, no, sorry, the other thing is that I needed to tell you is that in ancient Rome, or was it later? It was later. All right, so in the 19th century, we have this idea of these women as victims. All right, you never see them as anything else. So here you have the idea of shame, and the idea of femininity as being something which is fragile, which can be influenced. I just wanted to give you an example of Belle. After the misdeed, what has she done? She obviously just hasn't, got the butter in a mess or something. She's obviously done something very naughty. And this is, again, brought up with people then also dressing up as Vestal Virgins. This is Natchez with Louis XV's daughter at a fancy dressed up as a Vestal Virgin. So there was this sort of slightly erotic whiff about the whole thing, being a virgin and yet being dressed up like this. And then we actually have, which I think is hilarious, this is David. David who did Napoleon over the Alps, the great pictures of the coronation of Napoleon. Here we have a Vestal Virgin as an image of the purity of the Republic, because remember that David was a great Republican during the time of the French Revolution. So she is sort of seen as a bride of the Republic, and that's the way in which we're going to segue into brides of Christ. All right, so I just wanted to show you, if indeed this is possible, yes, what happens to the Vestal Virgins. Well, in 313, Constantine, and we'll be talking about him in a moment, becomes emperor, realizes that many in his army are Christians, and at the Battle of the Milvian Bridge, where he's trying to defeat another general to take over all of Rome, all of the empire, he sees a cross in the sky and says, we're going to fight under this cross. Of course, this story actually comes up later. I don't know what he said at the time, but he definitely made a big pronouncement that they were fighting under a new god. And they won the battle. And so Constantine, being very shrewd, he actually still has a lot of the old pagans, but he allows Christianity to be not the official religion, but was tolerated and no longer condemned. And we'll see the story about Christians being condemned in a moment. However, his successor, Theodosius, in 391 has now imposed Christianity as the religion, and paganism is to be reduced. People could still practice it, but it's no longer official, and the flame is snuffed out, and the Vestal Virgins wander off into the sunset. Now, what I want to show you is the extraordinary influence that this group of women, this group of priestesses, had on early Christianity, and the way in which virgins were treated at the beginning of celibacy and so on in the Christian church. But I also wanted to show you here the way in which the dress here of a very famous virgin, whom I'm sure you will have heard of, Virgin Mary, is based on the stola and the palum of the Vestals, even with the what they used to call a veil. It's not what we call a veil, but something going over her head. It's exactly the same way. And she's actually, this is a hand movement, which comes from the Romans as well. In fact, all of the gestures of Jesus and the gestures in particular of God are taken from Roman gestures. You know, when you'd get up in the Senate and you would say, I want to speak, or silence, all of these things are taken up by the church. If you actually go and look at mosaics and things, it's just really the Romans taken over by a different God. Here I just wanted to show you, this of course isn't a Vestal because she has a child, but the similarity of the pose, the similarity of the clothes, and even the frontality of it. So let's move then, because the point really of this lecture is many ways to show that although Christianity always sort of says that you know, this idea of virginity and chastity was something that comes with Christianity. In fact, there already in the ancient world is a very good example of the advantages for women of choosing this path. Now, I want to look at the story of Saint Agnes. And look at her story, and then in general look at the beginnings of chastity in the church. Now, St Agnes, I'm sure a lot of you have heard of her. She's worshipped in the Catholic Church, the Orthodox churches, Church of England, but also in the Lutheran Church, which I found a little bit puzzling. But here she is in a beautiful stained glass window with her palm of martyrdom. All right, this is a sign of martyrdom. Virginity, the white flowers, even the halo comes from you know, the Greek heroes and so on. And she has a lamb, which in Latin is Agnes. Now, it's quite possible, in fact, it's most likely that her name wasn't Agnes, it was probably Susan or something like that. But Agnes, you know, you get Lamb of God, you have the lamb that sits on the seals in Revelations, but before, you know, the seven seals are broken and the lamb is you know, it takes away. So she then actually has this attribute of the lamb. Now, we're now looking at the time of Diocletian. Now, Diocletian is not the person we just, Domitian, they both begin with D. We're now looking at about not 200 years later, but approximately that. Now, Rome is going through a considerable crisis, and in fact, Diocletian comes to power and decides that Rome is just too big to be ruled by one emperor. And so he splits it into the Eastern Empire, which is around Rome, and the Western which is around Constantinople, which will be Constantinople, and the Western Empire, which will be Rome, and puts two people in charge of that. So he is in charge of the Western, and the father of Constantine in charge of the Eastern. Now, Diocletian is now having problems with the Christians. Now, one of the sort of stories that the church has put forward is of persecution through the Roman Empire, always being, burned, thrown to the wolves, thrown to the lions, turned in, crucified in their thousands. This is mainly false, right? There was a short period of persecution under Nero on a particular occasion of the Great Fire of Rome, which he really believed had been lit by Christians. And then there's sporadic problems with the Christians, but basically the Romans were very tolerant of other people's religions. When they conquered other countries, they welcomed their gods in to their own, not to their own pantheon, but they didn't mind if a temple was put up in Rome, particularly to the Egyptian gods. They had, even though the Jews had been a thorn in their side, and in fact, particularly for Diocletian, for Domitian, they admired the Jewish religion because it was considered to be a very old religion, and also they weren't proselytizing. By the time you get to Diocletian, the Christians are a real problem, whereas during the reign of Nero, perhaps there were 7,000 Christians in the empire. Most people would never have met one. By the time that you get to Diocletian, there are hundreds of thousands of them. And this is because, of course, through St. Paul and the proselytizing of the disciples and so on. But the Christians had now started to be a real problem. Now, why? Well, first of all, the Romans couldn't get their head around someone who worshipped a crucified criminal and who really were prepared to be martyred for their beliefs. I mean, no normal Roman was worrying about the afterlife. They were worried about the present, whereas Christians seemed to be only worried about the afterlife. And in fact, they used to rush to martyrdom because martyrdom, of course, was seen, as you sacrificed yourself, as bringing you closer to salvation or in the afterlife. It's sort of, you got out of purgatory or whatever it was quicker. So Trajan, actually, there are letters from Trajan to Pliny, actually, our friend Pliny, sort of saying, Pliny's saying, what am I going to do with these people? They won't obey the orders that I'm telling you. And he says, oh, just go light on them, for heaven's sake, just don't stir up trouble with this troublesome group. And then there was another emperor. There was a whole group of Christians who suddenly decided they really wanted martyrdom. This was the way to go to, a better life. And the emperor said, well, look, quite frankly, I've got better things to do. If you wanted death, you'd go and jump off a cliff. And this is literally written down. So unable to believe their faith. But the real problem was, there were two problems, I suppose. For the upper class, the problem was that the Christians would not give a sacrifice to the Roman emperor, who was considered deified at the time, or to the Roman gods. And the only legal duty, I suppose, or the only duty that all Romans had was to sacrifice to the gods, because once you did that, it meant that you were sustaining and contributing to the continued welfare, prosperity of Rome under the favour of the gods. All right. However, now you have a considerable part of the population who just simply refuse. Now, the Romans, this has again, of course, been, built up by the early Christian church, these nasty Romans. In fact, the Romans went about it 3 times. You were given not exactly a summons, but you were told sacrifice to the gods or something will happen. Number 1. They don't do it, they come back a second time. Please, like a library notice, your book's overdue. please do something about it. On the third count, you were out, all right? So you would be punished. And under Diocletian, you probably would be put to death, all right? Under the other Roman emperors, you weren't. Some of the Roman emperors had been asking for this, and you'd actually get a little piece of paper sort of showing that you'd done your sacrifice, and that was it. And then, of course, the Christian church actually breaks up because you've got those who sacrifice and those who didn't, and so all of this goes on. So they wouldn't sacrifice, they wouldn't pay their taxes. I mean, that was a real problem. And they wouldn't serve in the army, or particularly in the upper ranks of the army. So there was a real worry that Christianity was penetrating the senatorial ranks. All right, so that's a real problem for the upper echelon of Rome. The lower echelon have a real problem with the Christians because they think they're seriously weird. They call each other brother and sister, incest, you know, what's going on. They drink the blood and eat the flesh of the, you know, they're cannibals. They always meet in dark little places. You can't trust them. They won't abide by the oaths of the normal Roman citizens have. So at the top and the bottom, you actually have this distrust and also, well, administrative problems with the Christians. So many of them are actually then taken out. So what's the story with Saint Agnes? Well, Saint Agnes is, of course, a beautiful young girl. I mean, that rules a lot of us out at the moment. You know, they're always beautiful, these people, and they're always young, and they're always virginal. All right. So as former virgins, you know, we can all sort of realise we had some. Anyway, she was at the age of 12, of course, again, this marriageable age, all right? It's quite interesting that the Christians also put this age at which she is taken. And she is, the story goes, I'm going to tell you the story. It's one of these stories that has become more and more elaborate as time went on and is used as propaganda for the Christian church, you know, to sort of look at how awful the Romans were and how pious and virtuous we were, the Christians. So anyhow, she's walking, she's obviously seen I think it's the son of the prefect of Rome, sees her in the street and falls in love with her, as you do, and then asks her to marry him. And she runs out into the street and says, "No, I can't marry you, I'm a Christian." Now, it sounds very sort of self-sacrificial, but is this possible? As we know, some of the Christians rushed to martyrdom. Was she acting on her own volition? Probably not, because she would have been under the power of the paterfamilias, her father, who obviously was a Christian family, so therefore maybe he told her to do this. Whatever it is, she rushes out and says, "No, I can't possibly marry you. I'm a Christian." So here she is, standing in front of the prefect, who's looking a bit concerned, and sort of explaining. She's already got a halo. She shouldn't, because she hasn't been martyred yet. And of course, here you've got Vesta with her, you know, with her flames, and you've got the flame going here. People in sort of medieval outfits, but never mind. So she is then taken to Diocletian's stadium, Domitian stadium. Now, Domitian, remember, the Flavian emperor who had finished off the Colosseum, he also had built in what is now the Piazza Navona, this structure which was for games which were called agone or agonalis, which is what you're going to get agone and Navona coming from. All right, so this is built up, and I just wanted to show you what it looks like now. This is the Piazza Navona now, and again, it's very much the shape. It hasn't really changed since the time, and now you can actually, if you go to Rome, you can actually go down underneath to see what is underneath. And let's have a look at what's underneath. Well, what's underneath are the arches, and the word used for this is fornix, and this is where the prostitutes were kept. So in other words, you couldn't possibly have a whole series of games without having a whole lot of prostitutes as well, probably slaves or whatever. Anyhow, that's where we get fornication coming from, right, from fornix. So our girl, Saint Agnes, Agnes at the moment, is sent into the fornixes to be a prostitute. And things start happening when she's down there. Um, she immediately, her hair grows to cover her nakedness. I mean, half her luck. I mean, you know, my head. All right, beautiful, russet hair. Anyone who looks at her is blinded, and the prefect's son, who comes to have a little touch and feel, is struck dead. But being a future saint, she resurrects him. So she's being brought down here, as angel hovering here, bringing down the gleaming attributes of future sainthood. So the story goes on, because you couldn't just have her being taken out, being killed, but just, you've got to have what happened next. It's almost like social media. Do you know what I mean? Well, what happens next? Well, after this, they then tried to burn her. Now, this is very unusual. I mean, the Romans usually didn't burn people. It just took too long. It wasn't spectacular enough, and so on. This is much more a Christian thing. So it's obviously something basically brought back from later on. She's put in the flames, and the flames refuse to burn her. And then when they use different wood, an angel comes down and puts out the flames. So things are sort of getting difficult for the Romans. So finally they did what, of course, they would have done in the first place, which was to slit her throat or to decapitate her. But this is getting really weird. This is now Domenichino's showing of the death or the martyrdom of St. Agnes. So here she is with her martyr's robes, the red of the martyr, blood of the martyr, white of purity, being stabbed in the neck. Now, why in the neck? Because that's how you kill a lamb. Okay. You've got a pile up of dead bodies here. These, of course, are the people who've looked at her or been blinded. And so all of her sort of miracles are brought up. And here she is fluttering up as being given the crown of martyrdom and the palm of martyrdom by Jesus, who's on his cross. You've got God up there and the Holy Spirit, and you've got all the angels tinkling away on various musical instruments. So this is what Baroque art, this is the Counter-Reformation that we'll be talking about next week at its best. So this was the story of St. Agnes. Now, let's have a look. Oh yes, well the story goes on, because what happened then. I mean, so they then found a sister who was a foster sister. This was who in actual fact was a saint who'd lived a couple of decades before, but she's brought into it, and as she goes to pray on where St. Agnes has been buried, she is stoned to death by those pesky pagans. Now, we now sort of go forward, not very much after Domitian, to the time of Constantine, who was about 30 years after Domitian, where the purge against the Christians is stopped forever under Constantine, and he then establishes Christianity as the religion at the end of his life. But his daughter Constantina now has really got so much with Christianity, she now has visions at the tomb of St. Agnes. So here is St. Agnes with that palm frond, and Constantina with her crown, having her vision. So in the meantime, martyrdom, of course, was the fast track to heaven, I suppose. But also, what had happened in Christianity was that there was an increasing number of women who had decided that they would take the same sort of path as the Vestal Virgins. In other words, they would be celibate, and by giving up their fertility and giving up their life as a female, because this is still in the Roman world, that was what a woman was, they would consecrate their virginity to the welfare of the church. All right, so in other words, the state of the Romans now has been replaced by the welfare of the church. Now, these women were completely different. They came from all classes of society. There were thousands of them. They didn't have a strict uniform. They didn't live in groups, but they did have a lot in common. Now, celibacy was encouraged early on in the church, first of all by St. Paul, for men, but also he doesn't rule out women, and then it is taken up by Saint Ambrose of Milan as well, who encourages virginity in women. Now, it is considered that by making a sacrifice yourself, because of course the Vestals didn't make the sacrifice themselves, they were made to, you know what I mean? They were chosen, that was it. These women voluntarily do this, and so this is considered a kind of sort of martyrdom for the church, of giving up the flesh and the desires of the flesh and all of, you know, eating nicely and all of those things which relate to a good life on earth, which is what the Romans really were more interested in. So therefore, they also enter this strange sort of state of being almost like female eunuchs. But also they take on masculine characteristics, just as the Vestals took on the masculine status of the Senate and so on. And what do the virgins of the early church take on? Well, there's this idea at the time that men were spiritual and that women were carnal. And so only by giving up the carnal side and being a non-woman would you have access to spirituality, to the spirituality that men found so easy to come by. All right, and totally without a smile. And St. Ambrose actually calls these women masculine. He actually uses this word for them. So you then have this strange situation of this group of people who are neither male nor female, and of course, like the Vestal Virgins, which I didn't mention, they have their hair cut off. The Vestals, first of all, had their hair cut right off before they were officially taken in and had their hair braided years later. So, of course, these Christian virgins also have their hair cut short. They wear men's clothes and, you know, the sort of cassock type of outfit and so on. However, what happens when these women, for some reason, or these people now, fall back and actually either enter into a sexual relationship or something like that? What does this mean? Well, it means that they have totally betrayed their own vows and their vows to the church, because they were not, you know, related to the Pontifex Maximus as the Vestal Virgins, but they were the bride of Christ. All right, so it is seen as adultery, which of course is punishable by exile or death under the Roman system. But not only that, it means that they lose their position in society completely. So they're defranchised from the Christian community and outcast. But worse than that, it means that they are excommunicated. And of course, that means that there is no repentance, there is no return from this at the time. And it meant that they will forever then suffer in hell's fires. All right? So what I'm trying to look at here is that being a virgin was a fairly difficult tightrope, an official virgin. It was a difficult tightrope to walk. For the Vestal Virgins, you could actually be, tipped and accused of all of the things that went wrong with Rome, or you could be accused of having fallen into the arms of the devil. So anyway, this is the situation, but it didn't, of course, affect our St Agnes, because actually, if you were a virgin, you were closer. And the more you sacrificed, the closer you were to heaven. So if you were a virgin and a martyr, wow. Yeah. All right, so that's St Agnes. Now, a number of tombs, a number of churches are set up. Sorry, 11:30. I'm just going for a few minutes. The This is St Agnes outside the walls, and this was a church originally. This was set up. Was probably these are the St Agnes catacombs, which was set up by Constantine's daughter, and then later this church, which is also set up. Now, I want to show you, it's actually above ground, and to go into the church you actually have to go down underground into the catacombs of St Agnes, where her body theoretically was. Then you go back up into these beautiful mosaics. So here we have St Agnes in glory with Pope Honorius, who is actually showing the church which he is going to build in her honour, and a subsequent pope who has a jewelled catechism book that he's giving God the Father in the highest levels of heaven, reaching down to bless her. She is wearing the robes of a Byzantine princess. All right, she's an Augusta. This is still under the empire. Here she has fire under her feet. She's dressed in the beautiful little shoes that the Vestal Virgins would have had. She's wearing this extraordinary jewelled outfit, or dalmatia, which also would have been worn by the empresses. Now, I just wanted to show you at this time, some of you have been to Rome with me, and we would have been to Santa Prassede. So there were a number of these saintly women who were martyrs. Another one was Santa Prassede. The Catholic Church now has sort of not decommissioned a large number of them, but I don't think they're any longer in the calendar. But what you get are these beautiful depictions of Christ with, again, Santa Prassede and her sister as Augusta. Now, the Santa Prassede, her job, and this is what I'm talking about by sort of Christian propaganda. We're now looking at it, that every second person was being pursued and killed by the Romans. Certainly not true. But Santa Prassede has the rather gruesome task of going around sponging up the blood of martyrs and squeezing it into a jar and then putting it underground. And you can go to this church and see where, theoretically, the well of martyrs' blood was. So people were absolutely overcome by this. The pilgrims had come to Rome, which we'll be talking about next week. They come to all of these churches and get indulgences for coming to see the bones of the martyrs, or where the martyrs had operated. I want to very quickly now go to the last part. So we actually have her burial place, but we now jump from ancient Rome, or 300 AD, to the 1600, 1700, to the Baroque era of the Counter-Reformation of the Church. And this, of course, at the time, Luther's come out, against indulgences, all of that sort of thing, which I might talk about next week. But one of the things that the Protestants don't have any interest in is the idea of martyrs, the worship of relics of martyrs, and also this idea that you mustn't have images. Whereas the Counter-Reformation uses architecture, uses sculpture, uses all of these things to bring the faithful in, to show that the church, is here and now. You can experience it with this glory of the martyrs and the way in which they're depicted. So back at the Piazza Navona, and here we have the Pamphili Pope. This is Pope Innocent the 10th, who will spend a fortune building this particular church, which is Saint Agnes in Agony. Now, she's not in agony, she's in the Agony where the Agonali games took place and where she was supposed to have been finally martyred. All right, so this is an extraordinary church, which was originally the Rinaldi brothers started, but Borromini, the great Baroque architect, is responsible for this really extraordinary building. Now, I could never, that's St Agnes, that's where this comes from. The inside, it was all built in the one time. So you don't get, as you do in a lot of churches, you know, one thing from one age and then someone's put up a St John, you know, from the 20th century. It's all the same, with the exception, I don't know who's put this thing up there, but anyway, it's what Borromini is great at is with a small space, he weaves things in and out. The pillars come in and out, and you get this impression of being compressed and embraced actually by the building. So, but it's also about the dynamism of the church, the movement, the renewal of faith. Now, some of us went, do you remember, Derek and Joe? We went there and had a concert there. So here we have these, and these, instead of altarpieces that all look different, you have these magnificent altarpieces which are made out of carved marble. I couldn't get enough of this place. I actually taught a course in Rome, and we were staying in a convent just down the road. And I used to go out every night and sit in the church, and the nuns thought I was just, marvelous. All right. So anyway, we have this is the inside. You know, the beautiful gilding, the marbles, the extraordinary dome which pulls you up to heaven. So I just can't resist this. So this is literally the apotheosis of St Agnes. All right, where she goes up. This is her here. She's here and she's swirling up, right up into heaven and out of heaven. And all around us here are the arches of the other chapels. It's absolutely mind-blowing. If you can ever go there in the evening, it's just wonderful. There it is again. Also, of course, to make this one of the pilgrim churches, you needed some bones. And so they went and took poor old St Agnes's head from the catacombs, and it's here near the sacristy, and it looks remarkably like a sort of rabbit skull, but I mean, she was supposed to have been very young. Anyway, this is the skull of St Agnes, which you could come, you know, relics were the thing that brought you to Rome on the pilgrimage. And of course, there's going to be a Jubilee year next year in Rome. Everything's being, you know, cleaned up, just a bit like Paris Olympics, and pilgrims are going to be coming to all of these places of relics, and they still hold an extraordinary power over people, even though people sort of realise probably that, anyway, I'm not sure what they think. So what I really have wanted to say today then is that the stories that we hear of the early martyrs and the virgins of the church are in many ways just stories, and they're not something that came from nothing. They owed, in many ways, their origins to the priesthood of the Vestal Virgins. And in fact, even though they're years and years apart, the format of the life of these women was not incredibly different. They actually were a third gender for a while. Thank you very much. Do you have any questions? No questions?
Well, now with all the genders,
Yes.
third genders and fourth women now, how do we explain that? I didn't know any of that.
Yeah, well, this is a legal it's not what they decided about themselves, which is what people decide now. This was the way in which they were seen legally, and seen by the state, and seen by the church. So it's an external denomination, not the way in which you decide that you're neither one thing nor the other. But that's exactly what the status that they were given, neither one thing nor another. Whereas now you're assigned to it. When you transition, I don't know how we got onto this. You're assigned to the one that you transition to. Yeah. Whereas these women,
I'm told to be there.
they were seen as neither one thing nor another. So, but it was prestigious in both Christianity and in the ancient world. So I don't know how many of you are sort of regretful that you can't be a Vestal Virgin. Because the other thing that I forgot to tell you, of course, is that, I mean, why would you not? I mean, be a Christian virgin. I mean, you weren't going to die in childbirth. 1 in 3 did. You weren't going to get dreadful venereal diseases, and they were dreadful at the time. Don't forget that most Roman upper class men were bisexual, and spent a lot of time on campaigns elsewhere. What else? You weren't subservient to your husband or your father. No kids to worry about, homework, dishes. I mean, so, it had a lot of advantages. But seriously, the nuns and the Vestal Virgins lived decades longer than the married women, who would, in ancient Rome and even later, would be dead in their 20s. Was the fact that you could marry, Vestal Virgin could marry when they were left at about 42 is already like 20 years more than the average mortality. So, and the same thing with being a nun. It was, yeah, not just that, you had a career path. You could become, I could have been lecturing people with Mother Superior Sylvia. Saint Sylvia, it's even better. It's got a ring to it, hasn't it? Yeah. Okay, well, thank you very much. And we're looking at a completely different, well, not so much virgin martyr, but next week it's incest, betrayal, and murder. So whoever said Hawthorne was boring? Yes.
Observation. If I've understood correctly, your what you told me about Saint Agnes, the men who looked on her were blinded, and yet her death was from a man cutting her.
Oh no, they looked on her lustfully. Oh, you missed that. No, you missed it. I've got to turn that out. Yes, they were wanting to do naughty things.